Elizabeth Seton lecture series. For those of you who were here last evening or this morning, welcome back. As the short biography on the back of your brochure will indicate, Dr. Peter Paris, our speaker for today, comes to us from Princeton Theological Seminary, where he holds the chair of social ethics. But we're also very happy to welcome him as a native Nova Scotian. Dr. Paris has an impressive scholarly record of teaching, research, and publication. And for his contributions to the theology of Black churches and in the area of social ethics, he was awarded just this past June an honorary degree from McGill University. The rest of his qualifications I will leave to you to read. Those of you who heard Dr. Paris last evening or this morning already know his ability to convey his message with clarity and conviction, and also his ability to engage his audience both at a theoretical and at a practical level, as the question period certainly indicated. So, continuing his theme of Christianity and social justice, we look forward to hearing Dr. Paris now to speak to us on the comparative struggles for racial justice in the United States, Canada, and South Africa. Dr. Paris.
Thank you very much, Professor Bellefontaine, for your warm words of introduction, and good afternoon to all of you. I would like to say that this is an excellent place to come for hospitality. I've delighted being here for the last couple of days. It has been a warm experience, and I feel that I've gotten adjusted to the very pleasant spirit that seems to be alive and well in this place. I see and have spoken already with several friends whom I haven't seen in a long time, and both today and yesterday, it has been a delight to see these people come out for these lectures and presumably struggle for parking space and finding the building and things like that. So I feel honored by your presence. In discussing this subject today, I will focus more on the Canadian experience than on the American and South African experience, so I will touch both of them. I will be happy in the discussion to speak about issues pertaining to any of them in more depth, if you like. I had the good fortune last summer to spend the month of August in South Africa, and that was a very extremely good educational experience for me. I had been studying South Africa for many, many years, but it was nothing like going there for everything to come into very sharp focus. And then I've had wider experiences in other parts of Africa as well. I say that simply to form a kind of background for this lecture. The key element in understanding the nature of social change is the purposeful activity of voluntary associations that aim at correcting some problem or problems in the social order. Voluntary associations are the source of creative initiative and persistence in defining public issues, mobilizing support, and advocating necessary correctives. Their power lies in their capacity to energize their constituencies, to coalesce round a common cause, and participate in activities that disturb the regular patterns of thought and practice held by the relevant centers of power. By fomenting social conflict, voluntary associations seek legitimation for and redress of their moral claims. The more approximate goal of legitimation is realized when the relevant centers of power agree to negotiate, and the final objective is evidenced in a mutually satisfactory redress of the problem or problems through a policy agreement. This process may be a relatively simple one, evidenced most often in the arbitration process to resolve management labor disputes, or as complex as the quest for civil rights in the United States. Because there, in that quest, the objective necessitated the involvement of various levels of interconnected governmental and judicial processes, all the way from local governments to the United States Congress, the Office of the President, and the Supreme Court. How voluntary associations have functioned in the United States, Canada, and South Africa relative to the quest for racial justice accounts for the respective rate of social change and the form it has taken. As I stated in a previous lecture, voluntary associations require certain necessary conditions before they can exist at all, 3 of which I will mention. 1, they require legitimation and protection by law. 2, the absence of terrorist threats for the public expression of grievance. And 3, the availability of an adequate number of unfrightened, self-conscious, discontented people who desire social change and are morally disposed towards being moved to act in pursuit of it. These are important conditions, necessary conditions. 1, that the law supports their existence. 2, that you do not have terrorist activities like the Ku Klux Klan and others that will terrorize you for expressing public grievance. And 3, that there is an available resource of people who are moved and are willing to put their lives on the line, so to speak, in pursuit of justice. Now, with respect to racial justice, the form of its pursuit and the rate of progress in its attainment are directly I'm not saying this very well. That is, with respect to racial justice, the form of its pursuit and the rate of progress in its attainment are directly proportionate to how free and courageous its advocates are. Since the formation of voluntary associations with public purposes of bringing about change requires freedom and courage. I should like to illustrate this thesis by discussing 3 different situations: Canada, the United States, and South Africa. But first of all, let me hasten to say that I assume that those on whom racial injustice is inflicted, or for that matter, any other kind of injustice, that those who are the victims of injustice must be the primary agents in both resisting the injustice and in advocating justice. Others who might join in the quest must serve an auxiliary function. They rarely initiate the quest itself for systemic change on behalf of others. That is, the initiation comes from the people who are affected. It is a good analogy would be a person who is ill. They have to take the initiative, by and large, to go and seek help from a physician or whatever. And then the physician has got to listen carefully to them and their statement of where it hurts. The problem with paternalisms of various sorts is that they don't often listen very well, but rather assume what is wrong and set out to correct it. Can you imagine going to the doctor and the doctor not listening to you at all and just sort of looking at you and assuming what the problem might be and then proceeding to treat? You would not want to dispose yourself to such a doctor. Well, similarly, in terms of social change, I think that is sort of a good analogy. Acts of compassion and service are always welcomed, but should not be confused with the activity that is aimed at bringing about systemic change. Now, let us begin by looking at the Canadian situation. Historically, African Canadians have been publicly quietistic relative to their social condition, which was long characterized by social patterns of racial discrimination and segregation, which in turn resulted in widespread economic deprivation, political neglect, and general demoralization. These conditions were exasperated by the demographic patterns of early settlement that were shaped and controlled by the principle of racial segregation. When blacks came to this country, their place of settlement was proscribed by the larger white society. In the late 18th and 19th centuries, early 19th centuries, these freed and escaped slaves sought to acquire the farmland which they had been promised by the British government. In many ways, they were virtually wooed to this particular part of the world by being given free transportation via British ships during the Revolutionary War in return for various services provided the British soldiers. And they were told that this would be a land of freedom where slavery did not exist. And they were promised to receive crown lands and mules and money in order to get started. And alas, they received none of those promises. None of them were kept, virtually none of them. And thus forced to live on unfertile soil outside the boundaries of hostile white communities, their energies were totally absorbed in the struggle to survive. And in the first winter here in 1787, hundreds of them died simply from starvation and exposure. And later, the hostility was so great that some of their churches were burned by the hostile neighbors in Shelburne County particularly. That is a very long and painful story. And we don't like to remember those stories any more than we like to remember the stories of slavery, because they were too painful. But we need to remember them because they live on, whether we know the stories or not. Their effect lives on in various ways in the body politic. In their pursuit of laboring and service jobs, the majority settled within the parameters of Halifax County, although numerous small communities of African Canadians grew up in municipalities throughout the province. These ranging in size, sometimes from a minuscule of 2 to 3 families to an average of 30 or 40 or 50 families. For various historical and economic reasons, Tracadie and Pictou counties contained larger numbers of people by the early 20th century. The industrial and commercial development of Pictou County, which is my county, with the opening of the coal mines, steel foundries, and other manufacturing concerns, led to the rapid development of the African Canadian population in New Glasgow by the time of the First World War. These entered the most menial jobs, where they were subject always to sudden firings and layoffs. Their lives were characterized by a generalized anxiety with respect to job insecurity and perpetual fear of white hegemony, on which they were totally dependent for their livelihood. You see, there's one thing to live alongside of a larger, hostile race of people and to be self-sufficient. It is another thing to live alongside of that hostility and to be dependent economically upon it for your livelihood, for your educational and your economic livelihood. Now this situation was similar in many respects to that of sharecropping, where the worker seems never to be able to experience any measure of social or economic progress. And here I'm talking about a couple generations ago. On the contrary, life for the sharecropper and for African Canadians in Nova Scotia and for the majority of African Americans up until the last 30 years or so in the U.S., that life was experienced largely as a cyclical process of repetitive misery from one season to the next and 1 year to the next. A permanent job at a livable wage was the best that any could aspire to, and the few who experienced such good fortune tried to maintain their security through zealous excellence in the performance of their jobs and unquestioned devotion to their white superiors, often at the expense of their own personal dignity. Not infrequently, many felt obliged to assume an attitude of extreme deference towards whites, which over time became a habitual pattern of relating to whites. You see, this becomes an expectant thing in such a situation. It is similar to being in prison. The prisoners have got to figure out ways of how to relate to the guards. The guards are on the outside. They can make your life a little easier, or they can make your life much, much more difficult. And so the prisoners learn quickly which way to go, whether to have an easier time of it and therefore to give in to the desires and so forth of the guards, whether they want to or not, to keep their own criticisms concealed, hidden, or they boldly resist and become rebellious and therefore take the consequences for that. Very few African Canadians in Nova Scotia graduated from high school prior to the Second World War. This was due to many factors, not least of which being some of the following. One, the conditions of generalized poverty among the race, which necessitated children taking jobs as soon as they could. When you got to be 14 or 15, if you could find a job, whether you were a girl or boy, you did so, in order to help out with the family expenses. Two, the alienation of the race experienced in virtually all white schools, with virtually no role models whatsoever, because no blacks during those times taught in the school system. And if they had a job in the school system at all, it was not higher than janitor. Three, in many cases, well, I say that I was told the other night, and I might be corrected during the discussion period, that even today there are only 3 counselors who are black in the provincial school system, and that there are only 3 black principals in the provincial school system. That speaks something to the issue of role models, without which it becomes very difficult for the majority to survive in the situation. And 3, in many cases, blacks attended segregated elementary schools with black teachers who did the best that they could with their licenses and their low wages. Note that this pattern of segregated education constituted a 2-tier system of unequal education, which ensured pretty much that black children were often unprepared for the white high schools to which they had to go if they were going to continue their education beyond elementary school. That is, within the segregated system went up to grade 8. And then the children would be bused into the city in Halifax County to go to high school. But with the unequal preparation, they were then destined in large numbers to fail in the high school. And so the failure was not due to the children. It was built into the system. And that's what I'm trying to emphasize. And that's the kind of history that we have had. And it isn't just blacks who should remember this history, but it is a history that was established by the society as a way of structuring racial relations. And therefore, we are all responsible because we inherit these patterns and the residue of these patterns, whether we like it or not. And so it's not sufficient to say, well, I had nothing to do with it. But the point is, if one continues to administer and work in systems that have a history of racial injustice, then we are all involved and we are all responsible. Not surprisingly, most dropped out of school at the time of that transition from junior high to high school. And fourth, another reason is that no incentive for high school education was present, since blacks could not be hired in white-collar positions, regardless of their education. Prior to the 1960s, in most places throughout the province, no blacks had white-collar positions. It was not until a decade, that is, white-collar positions in predominantly white institutions. It was not until a decade after my high school education graduation in the early 1950s that blacks were permitted to register to train as nurses in the hospitals or the police academy, or to take secretarial and bookkeeping courses, and any number of other similar things. No blacks were employed as clerks in the stores. One of the saddest experiences I can remember is having a Boy Scout master who was a fine Jewish businessman and who owned a department store in New Glasgow. And during the Christmas holidays, high school students got jobs in the various stores, in the stock rooms and so forth. Various positions were created for the white high school students. This particular man was giving unselfishly of his time to organize a group of black Boy Scouts. Troop number 8 we were, in New Glasgow. And so I approached him when I was in 10th grade and asked him for a Christmas job in the stockroom of his department store, and was told that he really would like to be able to do that, but he couldn't, because there would be too much resistance from his customers. Well, you cannot imagine the kind of effect that had on me, even though I was relatively prepared for the negative response. You know, I wasn't totally blind, but I felt that since he was my scoutmaster, you know, that this might be the opportunity of getting a job in the basement storeroom for a couple of weeks. And And that served to demonstrate to me even more graphically the immense inequality of opportunity between myself and my white peers. And here I'm not referring just to myself. This is an example of what all of us as blacks experience. And Marion is pointing to herself up there saying yes, and she has a wonderful story of her life that parallels this in terms of the educational system. And I'm sure that there are others here in the audience who have similar stories to tell and could tell if the opportunity availed itself. With very few exceptions, the only blacks who went to university prior to the 1960s were ministers, and very few of them went beyond the abbreviated 4-year course issuing in a BTH degree. Dr. Arthur Kelsey is here. He and I were two of the early black ministers since Dr. Oliver to go to Acadia University and to pursue a straight BA degree and then to go to a Bachelor of Divinity degree. We were among that early first group who did that. Dr. Oliver did it in the 1930s, and he was about the first. I think maybe there might have been one other before him. There were teachers who went to university, and often they went to university on summer courses over a period of many summers, and then got their degree that way by working during the year and then taking the summer training courses for teachers. And these, we knew who all of them were. You can count them pretty much in the 1950s on the fingers of your hand, because we were very few. Since practically all of the black churches were Baptist, there was, I think, one AME church in Amherst, and since the white Baptist history in Nova Scotia tended towards sectarianism, that is, emphasizing a profound cleavage between Christianity and worldly affairs. I might be taken to task by some of my Baptist colleagues for making this statement, but I'm prepared to have that discussion. And since blacks were trained at Acadia University, where their theological training disposed them significantly, where their theological training did not expose them significantly towards prophetic criticism, but rather towards a pastoral ministry. That is, one aimed at helping their congregants by serving their needs, and by implication and otherwise, helping them to develop coping skills with their difficult life. And these coping skills involve being patient with their social condition and not conflicting with the predominant societal ethos. And so, in this way, unwittingly, in most cases, ministers and teachers served the social system. I underline unwittingly. They weren't self-consciously doing this, but they were serving the social system well by keeping themselves and their people in the favor of the ruling white elites. And this is more complicated, and I don't mean to be putting down the task of the ministry. The church was the only thing that we had that sort of held the race together and kept us together. And under the circumstances, we all needed the support of one another in order to develop these coping skills. But it is the case that it was very difficult for blacks to be employed in any of the white companies, industries, and so forth without having a letter of reference from the minister. You see, and then the minister, by giving a letter of reference, had to virtually say that this person was a good and trusted person, and so forth. Because if the person were a disturbing type of person, then nobody would employ them. So all of this served to sort of keep a damper on things. And I think that the larger social system knew very well what it was doing. And in this respect, I think, the ministry was not unlike that of many of the Roman Catholic orders that I know a little bit about, who provided much needed emergency and rescue operations, but very little direct challenge to the prevailing social systems. It is no accident that several of our ministers have combined the teaching profession with the ministerial vocation, both being largely service-oriented and viewed by the larger population as unthreatening. That is, they don't threaten the social order. And the ruling elites and the social ethos can pretty much continue as is. In a situation like the one I'm trying to describe, the people and their leaders exhibited an attitude of deference to whites in general because of their intimidation. That is, the way in which the white society intimidated us. And I'm talking about myself as well. We were just afraid of whites. If a knock came on your door and child says, there's somebody, or your mother says, who's at the door? And you said it was a white man, then you usually assume trouble. Because nobody wanted a white man knocking at their door. Because it frequently was trouble of some sort if it wasn't the insurance man coming to pick up the premiums. And the intimidation was real because on almost anything you tried to do, you had to get some measure of white support for it. Or whites could frustrate and thwart your purposes. That is, unless it was just things that you were doing within the community, the black community itself, but nothing that had anything to do with the larger community. Now, this psychological condition prevented us from initiating any public protest relative to racial injustice. And that's the point that I'm trying to get at. And I've been trying to pave or describe the conditions that led to this kind of public quietism, which did not mean that we were all content by any means. We were certainly not content. But we didn't have the necessary conditions to develop a public issue concerning the question of racial injustice. Thus, the experience of racial injustice and the suffering that it caused were confined to the private sphere of black experience, which was virtually invisible to any larger public sphere. That is to say, it was not until the 1960s that blacks were able to make the experience of racial injustice a public issue in Nova Scotia. Following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., a loosely organized group of young adults in Halifax County, along with the help and inspiration of Dr. W.P. Oliver, with minimal moral support from the larger black community and less from the churches, this group hosted a visit of 2 Black Panthers to Nova Scotia. And that visit was followed by a visit by Stokely Carmichael for what was called a black family meeting. And that is, the word was that whites were not invited to attend this meeting. And my experience has been that on the one hand, whites had little difficulties in excluding blacks from whatever they wanted to exclude blacks from. But whenever blacks began announcing in 1968 that whites were not welcomed to attend certain meetings, then it virtually became front page news in the newspapers because the whites were so shocked. And this was not a demonstration of racism on the part of blacks. It was saying that we need to have a family meeting by ourselves, like any other family, in order to discuss family matters. And then we will inform the public. Carmichael was the chief spokesperson for a radically new symbol in the American quest for racial justice, namely black power, and its concomitant principle of racial self-determination and racial self-development. Many feared that such novel, explosive rhetoric was tantamount to proclaiming a revolution. And much resistance occurred, both within the black community and in the larger white community as well. Now that event in 1968 served to inspire more than a few to expend their energy in shaping a public issue concerning racial justice and demanding the investment of significant governmental resources for its correction. Their activity was aided unwittingly by the publication of several reports by enterprising white journalists from outside the province on the poverty of the race and the public neglect of their welfare. Their carefully selected foci on the most economically depressed areas among blacks vividly brought to national visibility a problem that had long been concealed. In fact, many white Canadians were embarrassed to learn that Canada also had a race problem. Hitherto, they had thought of race problems as the preserve of the United States, and many had talked even self-righteously about that issue south of the border. All of this helped the rate of governmental response to the issue, which took the form of providing seed monies for community development programs administered by a new organization that called itself the Black United Front, an organizational program designed and implemented under the prudent guidance of Dr. W.P. Oliver, who had been at the vanguard of leadership relative to community development concerns for decades, and at that time was in the employ of the provincial government's Department of Adult Education, with which he had been associated since about 1950, but began full employment with them in 1962. Now, at that time, he was virtually the only minister who was courageous and independent enough to initiate advocacy on behalf of such an organization as the Black United Front, and to identify with the principles on which it was based. Support from the churches, here I'm talking about the black churches, came late and often reluctantly. The funding of the program by the federal government's Department of Health and Welfare, with a substantial 5-year grant of $470,000, served to legitimate the Black United Front in the eyes of many, and the subsequent benefits of certain jobs and tangible local resources, like the construction of local community centers, various incentive programs, etc., these helped in gaining some support, even though most of the churches seemed never to have embraced the Black United Front in any total way. I need to be corrected if you think otherwise, and I would welcome any corrections from any of you. In brief, the Agency for Social Change black private university, there was a black theological seminary, there was a black medical school. And so that meant you had the development of a black professional class who served the black population. Whites didn't go to the black hospital. Whites weren't allow themselves to be served by black doctors. Black doctors couldn't take their patients to white hospitals. So it was a parallel apartheid system that was fairly complete. That is the separation, a nation within a nation. Those various segregated institutions provided relatively independent spaces that nurtured an ethos of suspicion vis-a-vis the external racist world, which in turn nurtured the spirit of criticism, of humor, of knowledge and discernment concerning their social condition. Thus, some degree of critical social analysis and advocacy for social change appeared in some form or other almost everywhere. Martin Luther King Jr. went to a segregated elementary school, junior high school, college. You see, it wasn't until he was a graduate student that he went for the first time to an integrated school, not in the South, but in the North at that time. And that's just an example that everybody in his generation had the similar experience. But in those schools, what I'm saying, there was the opportunity of developing resources for criticism and social analysis. And as the people themselves became professional and so forth, you had some of the resources necessary, a lot of the resources necessary for constructive social criticism. For example, in the 1830s even, free blacks in northern cities held national conferences annually in order to evaluate the state of the race and deliberate about possible action. In South Africa, the African National Congress, commonly called the ANC, was founded in 1912 as the culmination of much voluntary activity prior to that date in the quest for racial justice. You see, the ANC just didn't start 15 years ago when we began hearing about it, but it goes back to 1912. In all of those situations, reliance on nonviolent methods was normative for the most part, even though a certain openness to violence was always present on the part of some, both in the United States and in South Africa. It is important to note, however, that the desires and actions of those in voluntary associations can never guarantee good results. And I said this morning, a voluntary organization doesn't guarantee good results. You've got to ask, what is its purpose? Because sometimes its purpose may be for what we might consider bad results. Their intrinsic good, however, lies in the democratic process wherein all who participate experience the humanizing effect of being affirmed as self-determining persons and citizens, free from every form of external hegemony. And that's the way that the churches function for us. They were places where we could go and feel safe in being ourselves. And that's one of the reasons why often we would even have some fights in the churches, because we were free to have fights, but often you weren't free on the job to have fights because you might get fired. But in the church, nobody was going to fire you. And so it was a family. And the family struggled as families do with one another's idiosyncrasies and problems and so forth. But it was the public space, and there alone could we begin to develop our resources, such as we had. But we didn't have the larger numbers of people as are present in the United States and in South Africa. And our segregated system didn't enable us to have our own high schools and colleges and professional schools and so forth, because we weren't large enough. And had we had those things, then our patterns of systemic criticism would have been quite similar to those in the United States and in South Africa. In police states like present-day South Africa, and in the southern states prior to the death of Jim Crow, where protest activity was strongly resisted by military force, much suffering and even death attended the resistance of racial injustice. Yet, in spite of that cost, the people persisted then and now in their protest, and that resistance evidences their humanity. I stayed with a family in Soweto, and there last year, and there one of their daughters, who is now 27 years old, she was in 1976 16. And there in 1976, she was involved with the young people in Soweto to resist on behalf of justice. And she said that the reason why they did this is that they, as children, had listened to their mothers and fathers all their lives groan and moan about their misery. But their mothers and fathers seemed not to be doing anything about it. And the children decided that they were not going to spend their lives moaning and groaning about their misery, but rather they were going to do something about it. And so they began attacking the Bantu educational system where they found themselves. And when they understood that the nature of the Bantu education system is that the educational system is always 2 years behind, at least, the white educational system. So that when you graduate from high school, you don't have equivalent educational standards as whites graduating. And that means you cannot then go on to further education. And so they were demanding an end to the Bantu educational system and equal education. They confronted the police. She said that part of their naivete was that they knew that the police would beat them, and they were using whips in those days, which they were using right up until a few months ago in South Africa, and the children would allow themselves to be whipped and so forth. But they never really believed that the police would use their guns. And this particular day, and she was describing to me, they were holding hands in front of the police in front of them, and the police raised their guns, rifles, and shot into the crowd. And the young boy whose hand she held was hit and was killed. And as you know, in Soweto, some 500 children were killed in that particular massacre. The pain of that, you cannot imagine. And when you meet people in almost every family that I met and talked with, and I preached in several churches and met and talked with people there, they talked about either having had a child killed or having children who are detained in prison and they have no access to them because they can be detained for long periods of time without trial or without even being charged. And families cannot visit. Families that have children that have disappeared, which is a major issue in South Africa, is the disappearance of children. And you don't know then whether they are in prison, because the prison will not tell you, or whether they are dead. And as the years go by, the families keep alive the hope that the children are alive somewhere. And sometimes they've had even to go into exile outside the country. But it is comforting to know that your child is alive. I'm talking at the emotional level of children, not just children whose lives are being given, but children are adults in South Africa long before our children become adults. There in South Africa, you don't say the future generation of leaders, because they are already leaders. They are already giving their lives voluntarily for others, not just for themselves. You don't give your life for yourself. And they are doing this even in a situation as proscribed as South Africa. They find ways of keeping alive resistance through organized activity. And the health of the people is determined by their measure of resistance. The health of anyone in a situation of extreme oppression is the extent to which they have the capacity to resist the dehumanizing process. Even in situations severely proscribed, the health of the human spirit is determined by the extent to which it resists dehumanization processes. The brokenness of the human spirit is seen in those who have lost the capacity to resist their dehumanization. And the most pathological of all social situations is those where the people no longer have the desire for a better world for themselves and their children. They view life as one of destiny alone, with no freedom. They view life as one governed by fate and not by a God who desires justice in the world. They view life as one which is characterized by a mood of despair rather than hope. And hence Jesse Jackson's plea to keep hope alive is the key to humanity as such, since the experience of hope presupposes some foundation in experience. You've got to have a vision of a better world in order to be hopeful. You've got to see some sign of good coming forth, even in its form as a seed, in order to be hopeful. No one was more hopeful than Martin Luther King Jr., who said even on the night before he died, that even if he be killed, that the movement could not be stopped because God is on their side. And that he spoke for the congregation when he said that he has seen the promised land, meaning that he has seen the vision of what life can be. We have the capacity of making it that way. He has seen the promised land, and even though he may not go there, he believes firmly in the presence of the glory of God. And Desmond Tutu and Alan Boussac and hundreds and even thousands of others in South Africa today speak similarly. They are as convinced that the goal is at hand as you are that dinner will be ready when you need it tonight. They have no doubt about it, because they have caught a glimmer of this vision of justice and of humanity, and therefore their resistance is the most healthful thing that can be seen in modern day South Africa. Thank you for being so patient, and I think I will end there.
Dr. Paris has agreed to respond to any questions or comments you may wish to make. I would encourage you to move to the mic, if possible, so that we can hear your comments and also they can be recorded.
Excuse me.
How was your experience?
That's a very good question. My experience was that the people who were actively engaged in resisting the apartheid structures and systems were all in favor of sanctions and of divestment. Even those who knew that they might lose their jobs, and some had already lost their jobs. But from their point of view, it was a matter of priority. They felt not secure living under this system where they have no vote and where everything that they have can be taken away at any time. The situation is so extremely severe there. Up until just a couple of years ago, black South Africans or Asians or coloreds, which are mixed race people who are separated from the blacks, that none of them could own land in the townships. And they might live in the townships for 20, 30 years, but they could not own land, and at any time they could receive and can receive notice to vacate and to be transplanted somewhere else, transferred. And people described that experience. They would be given a month's notice or something to get ready, and on the day of the time when they were supposed to be out of their house, the military would drive up with a bulldozer, and if they hadn't moved out, they would be moved out, and then the bulldozer would level the cinder block house so that they couldn't move back in. And then they would be given free transport to their next place of settlement. Children and all just uprooted and just sort of dropped in the middle of another township, maybe hundreds of miles away. That's the nature of that system. People who are so-called middle class today have all come via the same route of having lived in these small two-room houses, cinder blocks and so forth. And then if they went into an American company or a British company to work, and then the British company or the American company decide to do what they consider to be justice for them by giving them mortgages to extend their house, what they would then do is to build their larger house with the mortgage around this small two-room house. And every one of them is built this way. All of the samples of big middle-class type houses, they were enlarged from these small two-room houses. When they get the shell built, then they can dismantle from within the two rooms. And so this man who worked for a company in whose living room I was sitting told me, well, what will happen to me if I lose my job? He says, well, it means that I will have to go back to the two-room house that I lived in for 10 years. And that was right here in my living room. And so I know, and my family knows, how to do that, how to survive that way. So I don't put my trust in this kind of material progress. Without the political progress, then the material progress is meaningless. Now, the South African government loves to bring tourists to South Africa. In fact, you can go to South Africa free these days. Beware of any free trips to South Africa, because it's a matter on the it's a situation of the South African government trying to propagandize its situation, and what they will do is to take you into the townships and show you some of the middle-class type houses that are present there in order to show that, that not all blacks are suffering the same way, but rather to give the impression that we have a great deal of progress here. And you can go along and you can see the cars in the garages, and you can see the fences and the flowers in the lawns and all of that sort of thing. And that is a facade that covers what is underneath the system. And the commercial enterprises have fed into the system by providing the mortgages and for the cars and for the houses and so forth, in order to help the government to be able to show off this middle-class standard of living to Western tourists, so that they might go back and argue against divestments and sanctions. People who are giving their lives, like these school children I'm talking about, as a good example, say nothing of the Sharpeville massacre in 1961 and others since then. These people are not going to be consoled by being able to have a car or by being able to have a middle-class type house. They see the principles, and it is at the level of principle that the struggle is being fought. Now, this is not to say that you cannot discover, and maybe you have discovered, some people from South Africa who will speak against sanctions. It is difficult in this country to find very many black South Africans who will do that. But there are largely white South Africans who are against sanctions because they say, why, who will suffer? The blacks will suffer. Well, the white South Africans have never been so interested in black suffering until the issue of sanctions came along. What they really do know, and what really has happened, is that the larger South African economy has suffered greatly because of sanctions. And this is one of the reasons why the government now must necessarily figure out some ways of really dealing with the issue in a more constructive way. Whether they do or not in the future remains to be seen. But more than the handwriting is on the wall. The rand now is at an all-time low. Only less than a decade ago, I think back as far as 83, the rand was worth $1.20 in American currency. The rand now is worth about 30 cents. So that means on the world market, the South African economy is really very, very serious straits. Academically, to buy a book that costs $20 in the United States, it will cost somebody the equivalent of something like 80 rand. And 80 rand used to be $80, or more than $80 in South Africa. So so everybody is hurting. But the government continues to propagandize by saying that it's only the blacks who are hurting, you see. And but it's hard for them any longer to keep saying that in any convincing way, because all one has to do is look at the currency exchange and do some comparative analysis, and you can see that who is really hurting and who is being forced to change. The South African withdrawal from Southwest Africa, from Namibia, of its military campaign there is a direct evidence of this particular economic situation facing South Africa. They cannot go on supporting a military in Namibia as they had been doing for a decade. South Africa had led lots of people to believe within its boundaries. It led its own people, whites particularly, to believe that South Africa could go it alone, independent of anyone else. Well, no country in the world can really go it alone without decreasing considerably its present standard of living. And that's what they obviously do not want to do and are very, very anxious. All of life there is anxious. Nowhere in the white communities can you go and not hear people talking about the situation. Almost every white family has already in it members of its family who have emigrated, largely to Australia, and good numbers to Canada. But the largest flow of immigration, I think, is to Australia, where the climate and the style of life and so forth is much more similar. But young people in large numbers are choosing not to throw their lot into the South African situation for the future. I've given a rather long response because it became an opportunity for me to say some other things, and I hope that all forms a context for the answer.
Dr. Parris, what is the predominant religion of the black people in South Africa? Is it the Anglicans who follow Desmond Tutu, or do they belong to another another religion? What is the predominant?
Yeah, it's difficult for me to give you statistics, but the religion is Christian, dominant in South Africa, and you have all of the various churches represented there, and certainly, but how it breaks down in terms of percentage, I'm not sure, except that
He's a high-profile man in South Africa.
Yes, he is.
Does he have a great following?
Right. He has a great following, and his high visibility came about initially through his being the executive secretary of the South African Council of Churches, which is an interdenominational body that's similar to our Canadian Council of Churches, say. And it receives a lot of support from outside of the country financially. The Dutch Reformed Church, which is the state church amongst the Afrikaners, that church has had a history of developing mission churches in all of the townships. And for many decades, white Afrikaner pastors would also pastor a mission church in the townships. And then as the years went by, there developed a black pastorate for those churches. And so it's in those mission churches that are Dutch Reformed churches where a great deal of the protest activity is initiated. Alan Boesack's church is one such example of that. He being a member of the Dutch Reformed Church, the Dutch Reformed Mission Church. And that already designates the difference between it and the larger white church. Similarly, with the Anglicans or the English, white English population, they also had mission churches served for many decades by white ministers until they developed a black pastorate. But in keeping with colonial style of operation of many of the missions, the black pastors were educated only to a certain level, but not to a point of equality with the white pastors. And so they had to get themselves out of the country in order to get equal education, in order to get back into the country, and then come back into the country. Alan Boesack would never have been as well educated, or Bishop Tutu, as either are if they had stayed in the country. They were educated at this sub-level, had to go to Holland and to England, respectively, in order to receive equal education. Yes?
Recently in the news media, we've been hearing things that FW de Klerk seems to be letting up a bit, at people to protest. Now, I'm wondering if this is due to economic sanctions and the economic condition of South Africa. Is it due just basically, is it propaganda again, or what's your idea?
Well, I think it's a mixture of all of those. I think the economic situation is a factor. It's not just one thing. I think there's a propaganda thing. From the point of view of blacks in South Africa, realize that when we're talking about blacks in South Africa, we're talking about 30 million blacks, and we're talking about less than 5 million whites. And 30 million blacks do not have the vote. The system of elections is a farce from the black perspective, you see, because everybody who votes is already voting under the constitution of apartheid. And the white concern was constantly saying to Alan Boesak, Desmond Tutu, and others, go gradually, don't get things going too quickly, because that's going to make the Conservative Party stronger, the Conservative White Party, you see. And from their point of view is that we want liberalism amongst the whites to increase. Well, from the black point of view, liberals and conservatives are virtually the same. Because what they are doing is that they're all participating in in the apartheid system. And even F.W. de Klerk, he says that he wants things to get better and so forth, but he is absolutely against one person, one vote, because majority rule will put the blacks in control. And he doesn't want that. And then the most well-meaning whites will, at the base level, they really want some justice and so forth, but they don't want one person, one vote, because they say, well, what will happen to us and our privileges? Well, the blacks are saying that you will have a place along with all other citizens in this country, but your privileges that are yours alone and so forth, by virtue of your being white, those will not continue. You know, at the moment, you can go into Pretoria or Johannesburg, most of Johannesburg, Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, all of these cities, and inside of the cities, during the day, you'll see blacks walking to and fro and so forth, though you would not always have seen them walking on the same sidewalks, because historically, back until the 1940s, blacks had to walk on the streets where the traffic were. They were not allowed to walk on the sidewalks. But these people must all leave the city to a person at night, unless they have a job, watch person or something like that, to be there. But they cannot live there. And insofar as some do live in the city, it is against the law, but the law just turns a blind eye to it, because that helps out the propaganda again by bringing tourists and say, why, we do have some blacks who live in the city. Look, here's the street, and there's some blacks living in this city, you know. But it's against the law, so that they all have to be shunted out. Blacks who teach at the universities, the very few who are able to teach at white universities, or black students, who the very few who are able to go to white universities. The largest number of the students cannot live on campus. They live in the townships, where often the university builds a house and so forth in the townships for the black students, and then they'll use a shuttle bus to bring them back and forth. The situation is I mean, these are characterizations, typical characterizations of that situation, so that from the black point of view, it doesn't matter whether the government, which is all white government, is liberal or conservative if it is under constitutional apartheid, then it's not where we are, you know. But from the white point of view, they would see de Klerk as being an advance, as some measure of progress, and the lesser number of seats, the Conservative Party got less seats than was thought. And since de Klerk is advocating reform, it indicates that the general electorate is more disposed to some type of reform than it would be to turning the clock back completely, as is being advocated by the Conservative Party. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all of you for your presence, and on your behalf, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Paris, for your presence with us these last few days. Sister Maria reminded us last night that the Elizabeth Seton lectures focus on the Christian presence in the world, past, present, and future. And in your talks, in light of your Christian reflection upon the Black experience, I think you have shown us how the present is rooted in the past, but also how our action in the present can help to shape the future and perhaps lead us a little closer to the vision of the promised land. Also, you challenged us to be free and courageous in pursuing social criticism and social change, which would reflect a world where the God who is a God of liberation and a God of justice is known. Your message called us also to link the praising of God with prophetic criticism, especially when you reminded us of the biblical truth that to believe in God implies doing justice. And so for your Christian witness, your enlightening theological reflection, and for your challenging and even gospel-disturbing message, I thank you, and we ask you to come back home soon again.
Oh, true. And I'm just